Thank you very much for being here in this new lecture on economics and science fiction. The topic of today is time economics. Talking about time and economics, of course, and science fiction, we'll have to have some leaps of logic. So I thought it was a good point to start that, this very famous definition of anything that relates to time from Doctor Who, this kind of wobbly, timely thing that we don't really understand and our head will start spinning quite soon. And what we are trying to do is to put some economic structure into that. And as Paul Krugman said a long time, what we will try to do is kind of a serious analysis of a ridiculous subject, which is typically the opposite of what economics does. That is a ridiculous analysis of a serious topic, right? So I think that for some time or some part of this lecture, you will see that it doesn't make much sense, but hopefully you will see how, regardless, science fiction allows us to think a lot about time and in a number of dimensions, right? So as in the immortal words of Austin Powers, just relax and try to enjoy for the time being, because yes, our eyes will go and cross very soon, but we can have fun, and that's the purpose of the lecture. So we are going to start talking about relativistic time because, of course, the simplest way of thinking about time is through relativity, and science fiction that emerges quite often. The other main topic that you can observe, you can see in science fiction about time is time travel, which we will also cover. And relativistic time is, this idea that time is not universal. So unlike in economics and finance, where everybody has a common clock, all of us, we share the same time, even in different time zones, but it's very clear it doesn't pass differently to each of us. And hence we have a common discounting, more or less, because time is the same. Of course, people can have different preferences about discounting the future, but all of us, we know what a month is, and a month is the same for all of us. When we consider relativity, this completely breaks down. So it's no longer the case that people will have the same discount, and definitely it won't be the case that people will have exactly the same clock. So for instance, that if you are trading in space in a ship that travels faster than light, then and if you don't know, that will be the surprise to you, is that time will be passing slower for you on board of the ship than for people outside, let's say in Earth, so from Earth. So if you go around the solar system at close to light speed, then time will pass slower to you than for people back in Earth, right? So then the same happens if you have watched Interstellar, not only when you travel at faster than light or as fast as light, or even at speeds relatively close to light, so 30% of speed light is already, you will experience serious time dilation. You will also experience time dilation if you are close to a massive object, like a black hole. Even if you are in a basement compared to the top of a skyscraper, time will pass slightly slower for you in the basement as opposed to the person at the top of the skyscraper, just because you are closer to a massive object, right? As I said, time is not even the same in the same planet. Let me remove this little bit here. So it will, then if that is the case, then you don't have a common clock. So returns should not be really depending on a common clock, should be depending on your experience time, right? Because there's the same time frame for everybody, okay? So in that case, then you start seeing something that you don't observe in economics and in finance, which is that time is specific to a person in the same way as preferences or beliefs are specific to individual agents. Right? Okay, so that creates interesting possibilities for what is called arbitrage. So in case you don't know what arbitrage means, basically is the possibility where by buying and selling, you can make some sort of profit. Typically it's in different markets, so typically when we talk about arbitrage, it's because I buy in a cheap even across time, right? But I buy cheap in a market and I sell to a more, at a more expensive price somewhere else. And in principle, if markets are efficient, the possibilities of arbitrage should be reduced to zero, because the prices would adjust up to the point where no one can profit from doing this type of arbitrage, this type of transactions. Now, when you have time moving at different speeds for different people, then interesting arbitrage possibilities emerge, right? Because then what you have is assets that have different maturities, that is, that give you a return at different points of time from the different perspectives of the people who either are traveling at different speeds or are closer to bigger objects, right? So let me give you an example if this sounds too abstract. So let's suppose that we have two markets. So let's suppose that we have market A, which is Earth, and we have market B, which is Cygnus. Cygnus is a space station very close to a black hole. And that means that per year that passes in Cygnus, there are 2 years that pass in Earth, on Earth, right? Because you are closer to a black hole, time goes slower for you. Okay? Right. So imagine that we have a common interest rate, because we have heard that, arbitrage will make that interest rates will be more or less the same in every market. So let's suppose that is 10%. Okay. All right. So suppose that then I do the following exercise. So I go to Cygnus, to the market near to the black hole, and I borrow £1 million. Now I know that if I borrow £1 million and the interest rate is 10%, I will have to return to the bank near the black hole. I will have to return 1.1 million, that is the 1 million and 10%, right? I'm borrowing at a 10%, right? So in principle, I can do that. So what I take is the 1 million from the bank and Cygnus, then I take it to Earth, right? So in a year, I have to pay 1.1 to the bank and Cygnus, but the thing is that on Earth, in that year near the black hole, 2 Earth years have passed. So as you know, compound interest means that in the first year in Earth, I will earn 10%. But then the second year, which still is half a year near the black hole, I will earn another 10%. That means 1.1 to the square. That is, I will earn a total of £1,210,000. Right? So I have effectively a return of 21%. So then what I will do, I will just go back to Cygnus and give to the bank there 1.1, and I will have made a profit of 110K. So interestingly, you can immediately see that when you have relativistic time, then arbitrage opportunities emerge. Then we should even have different prices. Which prices should we have so no arbitrage opportunities exist? So then what we will need is that the returns of interest, on the interest rate, or the returns of any investment in B, in Cygnus, should be smaller. So because the time goes slower there, then you don't have any arbitrage possibilities. So when the interest rate is 4.88, then this exercise of bringing money from one to the other doesn't give you any profit anymore. So, but the interesting thing here is that we cannot have exactly the same price of money or the same interest rate in the two markets, because they no longer share the same clock. So different interest rates, even though on Earth, different interest rates under the same clock would give rise to arbitrage opportunities. Here, actually, you need different prices to remove those opportunities. Okay. Now we can do the same with trade, right? So we have talking about finance, but we can do the same with trade. So this is this kind of comedy paper or humorous paper that Paul Krugman, the Nobel laureate, wrote in '78 when he was at his Grant-led associate professor. And we can use the same exercise there, right? So suppose that now you are a trader, you are on Earth, and you want to travel from Earth to planet Vulcan, and it will take you a year. And let's suppose that the prices are on the same clock. Basically, the two planets work under the same clock. They are in the same market, so they are part of the Federation of Planets. So there's freedom, single market there, right? And then imagine that what you want to do is, okay, I will buy as a trader, as a merchant, I will buy a bottle of very fine wine that I know that in a year it will get 10% increase in value. So today this bottle of wine can be sold at 100 pounds, but in a year it will be, I will be able to sell it in Vulcan at a price 10% higher, so 110 pounds, okay? So what I can do is I go in my ship that travels at 86% of speed light, so not speed light, but 86%, quite good. And because of Lorentz equation, that tells me that the time dilation will make that time will pass half as fast as on Earth and Vulcan. So that travel of a year is actually going to be, from my point of view as a trader, I will only experience 6 months. So that means that this return of 1%, that in principle, if I were to stay on Earth or on Vulcan, it would take me 1 year to get this 10%. From my point of view, it will only take me 6 months. So I will realize these benefits of these returns from an investment, not in a year, but in 6 months. Okay? So what is the solution? And then, of course, that tells me that you can profitably do this and experience wealth and fortunes much earlier than anybody else just by traveling at this speed. So what is the solution of Krugman? Is basically the solution is that the two markets should be under the same clock, should be across. The prices should be the same, nothing should be changing, and we should allow travelers to experience that type of enjoyment. But the thing is that will have to put a cap on the returns that someone will be able to obtain by doing that. So it won't be the case that this trade will give you 10% of return. It will have to be less than that. It will have to be actually the cost of actually traveling. Because if by doing this exercise of getting into the ship and going to the other planet, I can experience returns earlier, then the only way in which this will no longer be of interest to me is if the cost of this travel is precisely the benefits that I will obtain by doing this exercise, right? So in this particular case, if basically from the experience of the trader, I'm experiencing a 10% return in 6 months, which basically means a 21% in a year. So actually what will have to be is that the cost of the travel of me taking the bottle to Vulcan has to be at least 11 pounds for me to decide not to go elsewhere. Right? So as you can see in this case, it's not that we will have to have different interest rates. Krugman's solution in this case is let's have the same interest rate or the same returns in the two planets, but it will have to be a lower one to adjust for the fact that the traders are experiencing experiencing time in a different way. Okay? Now, all this is very complicated and strange, but it's even stranger when we talk about time travel. No numbers, we are going to be dealing with no numbers anymore, but you can immediately see that this problem emerges here where faster than light travel or close to light speed travel is basically a technology to go into the future at a slower rate, right? So it's kind of time travel, only in one direction. You cannot go to the past, but you go into the future at a different speed, right? So the questions that we can ask is, okay, so what happens when actually we can engage in time travel, right? So fantasies to do it, right? So from the economic point of view, time travel is impossible, right? So of course, if you read, there are many physics and many other people that will give you other impossibility theorems. So for instance, the impossibility of time travel based on the fact that we don't observe time travelers, we don't encounter them, we don't see them. So why is that? And there are a number of reasons, but the economic argument for why time travel is impossible is related to arbitrage, precisely this argument that I just gave you. So time travel is impossible because if it were, then we could engage in this type of bringing money from the present to the past, right? So imagine if you have different returns of interest, different interest rates, different returns of investment At different points in time, different opportunities of investment, and ones are more profitable than others, then what we could do if we had a time machine would be just to take the money from our time and bring it to some other time period where interest rates are higher. But then if that were the case, then what we would observe is an equalization of time rates, because you would have suddenly a massive influx of, in this particular period, suddenly from somewhere all these funds are coming. They're coming from the future or maybe from the past. And then what you would do is there is a supply of funds, so typically the interest rate would go down, the same in the other way around, right? So you would observe an equalization of interest rates across time, because people are taking advantage of this opportunity, right? Otherwise, if this doesn't happen, then we would have just unbounded wealth. Someone could be jumping from one period to the other, making more and more and more and more money, right? And that's not what we observe. That's the thing, right? So we don't observe that interest rates basically are zero, that there is no volatility in the stock market to account for the fact that opportunities across time have to be the same. Hence, Reaganom's argument is that because we don't observe that interest rate is zero, because we don't observe that there is no volatility, that interest rate don't change, that the stock market doesn't crash or go up and down, that necessarily means that time travel has not been invented and it doesn't exist. Because otherwise we will have time travelers taking advantage of these opportunities. Okay? So either time travel is impossible or it's not available, right? So it's not a technology that is available out there. Now, of course, there are many people, and one of the questions, of course, is to counter-argue Reaganom, but there are many cases in which we can imagine that time travel might be feasible, but we don't observe it for some particular reason. In particular, for instance, the main assumption in this impossibility theorem that I just gave you is that markets are perfectly efficient, information flows perfectly, all expectations are adjusted immediately, and we know that this is not the case. So basically what the argument that I just gave you, the Reaganom's argument, is that time travel is impossible if markets are efficient, right? So if markets are efficient, time travel should be impossible. But markets are rarely efficient. There are many reasons why time travel might still exist, might not be possible. So first is that maybe the technology can be monopolized. So who says that time travel is available to everybody? It is true that in many cases you observe that in time travel narratives there are characters that make lots of money, but they are just one person that owns some device, so they don't create havoc in financial markets. So we could have this possibility of time travel if time travel is only available to a handful of individuals. It could be just very costly, so maybe the energy cost of time travel is super costly, so it's too costly to use. Or it might be, as in the peripheral or in other time travel narratives, that basically what happens is that when you go back to the past, you don't go to the same timeline, you just branch or fork the timelines, you create another one. In the peripheral, that's called a stub. So basically when you go to the past, you create a new past, so it doesn't affect you. So maybe you are doing all these kinds of things, strange things in the markets, but you are doing it if you want, in another branch of the timeline, not to your own. So we don't observe it because no one has come to our past, maybe to another one, right? And maybe it might be that actually you cannot take the money, it's only information that flows. So for instance, again, in the peripheral, it's only information, not people or goods that travel. And hence with that, you cannot just take physically an amount of money or something like that. You can learn stuff. Maybe you can even watch the past. You can even observe what happens, but you cannot actually take funds or goods from one period to the next. Okay? Or it might just be that there is no future economy. Maybe no one wants to travel to our present timeline either because they don't need to. Because why? I mean, in Reaganom's arguments, the basic idea is that the people want to have more money. Maybe there's no money in the future. Maybe they don't want to earn more profit. Or maybe it's just the green prospect that there's no future. That's why there's no one coming. So from there, we could place a taxonomy of time travel narratives, which is going to be useful for me. Maybe not necessarily for you guys. So this is just one that I came about. So there is this a 2x2. Again, it can be groups. It can be anything. I think that there are two here, the raw ones, which are pretty much accepted. You will see it in many places. Is when the past can be changed and the past cannot be changed. Okay. So there are many narratives where people try to change the past to realize that it cannot be changed, or it cannot be changed to start with, right? So we will have that, and in the other dimension, we will have the situation where actually the timeline is shared, right? So what I do in the past, if I do something, I will be affecting everybody, but there is also the possibility that in some time travel narratives, actually the timeline is also private. So I just travel to the past of my own self, and I don't really change anything. So there is, for instance, these narratives here. So the man who murdered Muhammad is my favorite, when there is this guy that goes back and kills all kinds of historical figures just to realize that he's only changing his own past. Is not changing the past of humanity as a whole, right? So we could have all these type of time travel narratives depending on whether the timeline is shared, can be changed, it cannot be, and so on and so forth. We're going to be focused on a few of them. I'm going to be starting with the one there in green, the closed loop economy. That is one where the past cannot be changed, so the timeline is fixed. Right, so you cannot travel to kill your grandfather, because if you were to do that, you would not be here. So actually, you cannot do that. And that's basically the idea. And there are a number of time travel narratives that are like that, right? So 12 Monkeys being one, the wonderful short story, The Merchants and the Alchemist's Gate, is precisely these situations when you travel to the past, so you travel to somewhere, or the past to the future, just to realize that you cannot do anything to change anything that has happened, right? So imagine that this could be done, right? So if that breaks one of the main strong points of, one of the strongest points, sorry, of economics, which is the identification of causality. So if you have taken any econometrics or any statistics, there is a lot of emphasis, or experimental economics or experimental political economy, there is lots of emphasis on causality. You do something to try to identify, right? There is a policy, you observe the effect, right? So there is cause and effect. But when you have a closed loop in time, there's no cause and effect. Effect can precede the cause, and so on and so forth, right? So it is unclear. You have these closed loops that cannot be changed, and there's basically everything is closed, and there is not a line that clear identification between one or the other, right? So first, you cannot come up with counterfactuals because you cannot change anything, right? So the things that have happened, and that's it. So there is no possibility of saying what would have happened if, I don't know, if I were gone to the left rather than to the right, or if I had arrived home 5 minutes earlier than yesterday, right? So basically, there's no possibility of doing this treatment versus control methodology that we use in economics or in behavioral sciences. There is total endogeneity. So when you run a regression, X, Y, what is X and what is Y, what is cause, what is an effect, it's just correlation, if you want. There's no causation because Y causes X and X causes Y because they are all part of the same loop, right? Then that means that there are no instrumental variables, so you cannot use anything to try to ascertain what is the causality. As you know from econometrics, then there is the problem of endogeneity. There are many cases in which you are not sure whether X causes Y or Y causes X. So there are many cases in which you don't know whether the adoption of policy has created some effect, or maybe a change in preferences in people, or maybe the changes in preferences in people was the cause of the change in policy, and maybe you can use instrumental variables to try to ascertain what was the cause, in which direction. But here, you cannot do that because everything is a big loop. There is no possibility of identifying causal effects. There is no natural experiments because there is no randomness. There is no experimentation, no exogeneity, Everything is already priced in everything, right? So if we know everything, if everything is a closed loop, we know perfectly well what's going to happen with all futures during the Iran war. We know perfectly well the prices would have all the information because everything will be known because everything is a closed loop, and so on and so forth. And also you have what is called knowledge of self-consistency, which is this idea that any events that will lead to a paradox will have a probability of 0. So the way of thinking of this in time travel narratives, if you may have watched or read, is these instances when you see that time kind of heals itself. So there is someone that is trying to change time, but then all the events go in the direction of actually not having any change, and that is what is called the knowledge of self-consistency, which is this idea that the universe needs this self-consistency because paradoxes could destroy the universe. So basically what happens is that the universe will move to these events that can break the continuum to a probability of 0. Okay? I told you your head would spin at some point. Now the interesting thing is that, as you can see, in all these narratives, the 12 Monkeys, the wonderful Chris Marker film La Jetée, or this Ted Chiang short story, the key element, the key tension in the plot is that individuals, protagonists, are not given perfect foresight. So they don't really know that they are in a closed loop, right? So typically that is how these narratives are interesting. Now, of course, when you have time travel, you can even meet yourself, and this is a very interesting point from the point of view of economics, this idea of meeting oneself when you go back to the past, okay? Now, what it does and what is useful is that even regardless of whether it's a private timeline or you share it, so basically you are traveling to your own past, or you are just going to the past and encounter yourself, is that it makes visible something that is very present in economics and in behavioral economics, which is that actually we contain multitudes. We are actually individuals who don't have a unified self across time. We have different selves across time. In many cases, we have different objectives, right? So basically, this idea that there is not a unified self is that we think we are the same person because of memory. Not even our atoms, your atoms at the moment are the same as 10 years ago. So physically, we are completely different. It's just memory. But then if that is the case, if it's just memory, this thread that is holding all ourselves together, then we don't have unified preferences necessarily. Then what happens is that you are not an agent that are just deciding. You are just engaged in an intrapersonal bargaining problem with your future and your past selves, typically your future selves, because the past is the past. But you are engaged in this bargaining in which you are trying to obtain some objectives which perhaps your future self doesn't agree with. Okay? So if you think in your different selves as different people, then you are not saving money for yourself, but actually you are being altruistic to that stranger that it will be your future person. Or procrastinating, right, when you are deciding not to write your sci-fi essay this weekend and the next weekend, basically what you are is depriving your future self of the opportunity of consuming their resources, right? When you are delegating an unpleasant task to your future self, which is a different person, is not you at this moment. Or if you yield to temptation that basically, I don't know, you eat the chocolate now that you have in the cabinet somewhere in the cupboard, then you are denying that chocolate to your future self, who might be interested in eating this chocolate in a week, right? So let me show you this with an example, right? I think that once you see this, you cannot unsee it, this idea that we are basically different people with different objectives, which I'm sure you have experienced as a human being. So suppose that it's Thursday, and you have to hand your sci-fi essay on Monday. And at this moment, you decide what to do, when to write your essay. You have all done all the research is kind of done. You just have to sit down and do it. So let's suppose that you have to decide at this moment when to do that, when to write it. You can do it on Friday, on Sunday, or Saturday, Sunday, or on the same Monday. And these numbers here are the utility for you of doing each of these plans, right? So for instance, if you do it on Friday, then on Friday you have to pay the cost of paying 5 for the unpleasantness of having to sit down and write. But then after that, you enjoy life. Maybe on Sunday you go out with your friends or whatever, and so on and so forth, right? Then you can do it, let's say, on Saturday. On Saturday, you will have 0 on Friday because you are thinking, oh my God, yeah, I have to do this thing. It is kind of eating you alive that you will have to do this. You are not enjoying that much, but after that, you kind of enjoy it, right? And so on and so forth. Okay, so imagine that this is the situation. So if you were to look at this from the perspective of Thursday night, where you have to decide what to do, then you, for instance, could look at the total sum of your payoffs, right? This could be a good criterion for you to look at what is the best possible plan if you just add up these flows of payoffs. And then in that case, you can see that the best situation is to do the essay, to write the essay on Saturday, because then you get -5, 10, and 10, so you get 15. Whereas if you do it on Friday, it's 14. Clearly, you don't want to do it on Monday. Clearly, you don't want to do it on Sunday. It's not great, right? So from the perspective of Thursday night, you say, okay, you know what? I'll do it on Saturday. And then Saturday comes, and then you say, oh, if I do it today, I get -5, so why would I want to do it today? I could do it some other day. Right? I could do it later on, right? So you can see that the self that you were on Thursday night had a plan, was a planner. The person on Saturday is a different person that faces different incentives, doesn't want to sit down, and will typically want to push it, is the doer, right? So you can see that there is a conflict of interest between the two. Right? This is the idea of multiple selves that is present in this very famous paper by Richard Thaler. That is, of course, a cornerstone of behavioral economics. And basically, the idea is that we have to treat each of these people as different agents, as multiple selves, with different utility functions that depend on where now is. So for the person on Thursday night, the utilities, the now is Thursday and is different from the utility of the person on Saturday, right? So there is no just a unified person, a self, like a social planner of all these personalities, thinking what is best. There are different, it's a fragmented situation of decision makers, where you have a conflict between the planner and the doer, right? And what typically you will observe in these cases is that one of the selves, typically the planner, will want to change the incentives of the doer, of the future selves, in some way. Typically in 2 ways, either by giving them incentives. So everything that relates to gamification is changing the incentives of your future selves, right? So you use something, you give it a reward to your future self. So I don't know. So if today I go to the gym, then later I will have a nice coffee, or I will have a nice ice cream, something like that. You're trying to give your future self an incentive to do something that you know your future self will not want to do. Or alternatively, you can pre-commit. You may want to restrict the choices of your future self, either by removing the chocolate from the cabinet, either by making them feel bad about not going to the gym, or not seeing their friends, or not doing your sci-fi essay. So either by carrots or sticks, typically we are always engaged in this kind of negotiation with our future selves. Which, remember, again, time travel makes it very obvious because you have 2 people which just see each other, but that you don't need time travel to realize this. Time travel is a very good mechanism for us to realize this conflict. Now, we can also deal with situations where actually trade across time is possible. So we can move stuff, not only information or a person, we can move persons or goods. So there are a number of sci-fi narratives where actually time can be changed, and actually you can even move stuff and it's shared, right? So for instance, 2 of them are, I don't know if you can see it very well, is the Tomorrow War, and The End of Eternity. So in the Tomorrow War, if you have not watched it, it's not a great film. It's on Netflix, but it has the nice point that at some point, people from the future come and say, there is a war against aliens in the future, and we need to bring soldiers from the past to the present. So there is future for humanity. So that's migration, right? And in the end of eternity, there is this kind of corporation that oversees trade across time. So actually there is trade between different centuries depending on what they need, right? So actually when you have something like that, you could have individuals choosing a particular era because his wages are higher or the working conditions are better, right? Or the cost of living is lower, so you could have people traveling across time. You can also have opportunities for technology. Maybe you have health condition that now cannot be treated, so maybe you want to be moving to some other place, right? Some other time, sorry, not some other place. There may be some times where some resources or inputs are no longer available and we'll want to trade, right? So you can see basically time travel when it's like that is nothing but globalization. Right? It's free markets, it's people can move, freedom of movements of goods or of people is not that different. But if time travel like this is like globalization, then we could have, sorry, the best order would be this. Then you could have what in the peripheral is called third world in the past, right? So by the same token, you can have exploitation. You can have future, typically the future predating on the past, using the past as some country to be colonized, right? You can outsource your production. Maybe, I don't know, maybe you want to produce something is extremely polluting and the environmental regulations at the moment don't allow you to do this, and then you go back to, let's say, 15th century Scotland, like in the Staircamp Handshake. Up there is a very nice and fun young adult novel that I would recommend if you are into that, where a corporation goes into the past, not only to extract resources, but also to produce, because there's too much pollution in the present. You can extract people, right? Even you can even bring people. You can even use it, like in the peripheral, you can use the past as an experimental ground. So for R&D purposes, for experiments, to gather information, to develop weapons, right? So you take some weapons to the past and see what happens, right? Typically, what happens in these narratives is that it only goes one way. So again, you can see the why is called third worlding, right? Is that typically is the future that goes to the past. Of course, some people from the past, like for instance in the New Research for Mozart, in the Bruce Sterling short story, some people from the past want to go to the future, right? And there are green cards for people in the future, right? So you can go from the past to the future, but it's very restricted. Or you can have a situation like in Tenet, where basically what the future does in Tenet is just to conquer the past, wants to reverse the flow of time, and just wants to obliterate the past completely and completely conquer it. So it's not just colonizing the past, but actually conquering it. Okay. Now, because of that, there are also many narratives where you want to regulate. There are regulators of time travel technology. Because at the end of the day, time travel is just a technology. That's what it is. So, of course, it's lots of fun. At least I find time travel extremely fun. That's why I'm teaching this lecture. But, it's a technology. It's just a dual-purpose technology. It's like AI, right? And it's a dual-purpose technology that has potentially extremely large externalities and irreversible, especially if you think that the timeline is not mutable. So you can make changes in the past that will have ripple effects in the future. You can destabilize countries and economies by traveling to the past. You can, as we said, have lots of opportunities for arbitrage and market manipulation. So it's, of course, a technology that has all these bad consequences, and we have a technology with bad consequences. In principle, we should regulate it. Okay? So there are many, many agencies and time travel agencies and regulators in science fiction. So this is the commission from the Umbrella Academy. This is a background film, which is not bad. It's the time cop. There are cops across time that are there precisely to avoid these happenings. This is a nice Spanish series called The Ministry of Time, where time travel is owned by the government. So it's a public technology, it's a public policy technology, or Loki, that is basically these agencies that are there to ensure that the timeline is maintained, and that no one takes advantage of it. Of course, then when you have bureaucracies and agencies, then you go into the problem that typically in fiction, bureaucracies are depicted are portrayed in a not so great light. Typically they are corrupt or extremely bureaucratic, so you can see it here, right? Sorry, extremely bureaucratic, right? So you can see that it's not necessarily a solution. Typically there are also problems that come with these agencies. Okay. So then we can, from here, move to a situation where actually it is not people can trade across time, but actually people can trade time. So time is a currency. Now, this is kind of the most obvious economic idea behind time economics, is that time is money. We have heard that. So basically, I'm paid by the hour, or you can be paid by the hour. You have paid by months, or something like that. You could be doing something else. In economics, we talk all the time about opportunity cost. What you could obtain by using your time doing something else. So clearly, there is a monetary value we could put into time. And actually, the next question is, what if we use time as a currency? And actually, in the real world, there are time banks, and if you go to the Incas had a time bank that actually you could pay stuff with time by working. When you have time being a currency, then you buy and sell, like in time, you can buy and sell things by giving up time, your lifetime. So a coffee is 4 minutes, I believe. A car is 33 years or something like that. So in these cases, inflation is really bad, because if prices go up, then you have to pay more of your own time. So clearly, literally, is quite lethal. But then these narratives are very good in illustrating inequalities. Inequalities that are sometimes a bit hidden, right? Because inequality of money we understand very well. You guys understand it very well. But there is an underlying as well inequality in time, right? So for instance, in the case of in time, there are huge inequalities. You see, one thing that I like a lot about that movie is that you immediately see how the poor people are constrained. They don't have that much time, so they go running from A to B all the time because they don't have that much time. Whereas basically the rich people are immortal, they can do whatever they want with their time because they have made a lot of it, right? In the Quantum Thief, which is a sci-fi novel, hard sci-fi novel, their time is also spent, and then what happens when you run out of time, unlike in time where you just die, then you are moved to a body, and then you have to work your way back to society. So you have to earn the time, and actually time can even be stolen, right? Then of course these narratives, as I said, illustrate these kinds of very extreme inequality. So in the Quantum Thief, they call people that have lots of time, lots of lifetime, they call it millionaires, right? Instead of millionaires, they call millionaires because they have millennial of time at their disposal. And you may think this is kind of over the top. They are fun, but over the top. But then actually, as I said, these narratives illustrate health inequalities, right? So even in our societies, we have extreme inequality in health outcomes. Life expectancy is very different across social classes, even across geography. There are different diseases that have much different incidents depending on your economic, socioeconomic conditions. So what these narratives are just doing is put some metric, which actually is hidden in our daily life. We don't see it that much, but this metric, it is important, time rather than money. Now, if time is currency, then you can even have a market for time, right? So this is this interesting German film from a few years ago, is Netflix, And I don't think that is so well known. But if you are someone interested in economics or an economist, or you watch this film, it's amazing how full of economic concepts it is. So basically, the premise of this film is that there is a technology that allows rejuvenation, but you have to donate your lifespan to someone, right? So if I wanted to be younger, right? So any of you could lend me or donate me a few years, let's say 5 years, you will become 5 years older and I will become 5 years younger. So lifespan can be traded. But they are called donors, right? You will see why this is important. So sellers regain youth and sellers age and buyers regain youth. And there is a market, right, where you can use lifespan for everything. You can commute your prison sentences. So if I'm supposed to be in jail for 5 years, rather than spending 5 years, I just donate 5 years to someone, and then I will just go out immediately, or I can use it in my mortgage, right? If I don't pay, then I will put my lifetime as a collateral. I mean, at the end of the day, you know, if you have a mortgage, you will pay it in 30 years or something like that. So it's rather than paying, you just give away the 30 years. And in the film, there's an example in which basically you can get 700,000 euros for 50 years of your life. That doesn't seem great. And as I said, it is also a kind of a currency. And as you can see, you don't need to know much about the film just to know where this is going to be heading, because who is going to be selling this? Who is going to be selling lifetime? The poor, the vulnerable, the migrants, of course. Those are the people who are going to be selling time. So this is an example of what Nobel laureate Alvin Roth calls a repugnant market. So a repugnant market is just a market that we find repugnant because typically it deals with things that we think that shouldn't be traded, like organs, like slaves, people. You should not have a market for suicide or euthanasia. You should not have surrogacy, because we find that there are things that shouldn't be traded. Okay, so this film is perfect example of a repugnant market, the market for lifetime, right? Now, even if gains from trade exist, even if we understand that, I don't know, for instance, in the film, there is the main company that gives lifetime to Nobel laureates and people who potentially will use their time to do research for the wealth of humanity. Even if, you know, someone who doesn't have cannot have kids will have a kid thanks to surrogacy. Even if someone will be able to live longer if they get a kidney, we don't feel that the gains from trade justify, or is it problematic that these gains from trade justify actually being paid and selling and buying, okay? Donating is a different matter, right? Should everything be for sale? So it also an investigation into the limits of markets, right? Now, the point that Al Roth writes in his very nice article that I would recommend you to read, is beautifully written, is that repugnance also evolves with time and technology. So there are things that before were not considered repugnant, and now they are. So slavery was not considered repugnant, and now, of course, we find it extremely repugnant. And the same with other kinds of things. So, for instance, as well, even lending is considered repugnant under certain religions, and it was considered repugnant under Catholicism, and it's no longer considered repugnant anymore, right? So these things evolve in time and across technology, but we tend to think that if there is money involved, well, we find it even more repugnant. So what are the key concerns that Al Roth highlights, and that actually all of them appear in Paradise, in that German film that I just told you about? So first is an objectification, right? It's a violation of dignity in the sense that some people become objects, donors of lifetime, that maybe some exchanges that we as economists and narrow economists, we think are voluntary, because no one in Paradise, for instance, when the protagonist goes to this refugee camp and is trying to convince people to serve their lifetime, these people, they are not put a gun on their head and then forced to do that. They do it voluntarily. But is it really a voluntary exchange? Are these people not really coerced by the situations they're in? Okay? Then at the same time, it can undermine institutions and democracies. There is, I'm not sure we will have time, but obviously there are these narratives where the rich people are immortal, and then from that point of view, this gives them a lot of power, so potentially you can undermine democracy. And it's a slippery slope. Maybe you allow, I don't know, maybe if you allow surrogacy, why not a market for organs, or a market for people, or a market for other things, right? So the question is whether this can be made acceptable through regulation. Again, we are going back to regulation. Now, the next point that I would like to introduce, and I will not have time to go much into this, I will just leave you with that thought, is that when people have different time horizons, then they also have different preferences. So in the film, there is a number of interesting observations where rich people say, look, I'm going to be very productive, so actually giving money to me is efficient. I will have a longer time horizon. So actually in the film, it is even said that climate change was solved because the rich people were given enough lifetime, so they have a longer time horizon and they could see the benefits of investing into green technologies. So immediately you can see that if your time horizon, if your lifespan changes, it also changes your preferences, your discounts, your incentives to invest, to sacrifice something today to get something in return in the future, because this shadow of the future is very long. So the last thing I'll tell you is about longevity, right? What are the economics effects of longevity? So if you see here, this is the evolution of the age of death in 1950 and in 2018. So you can see that people live longer lives. And what these narratives of longevity in science fiction is also questioning us, what would be the effect of having an economy where people live longer? Now, of course, there is the issue of people becoming, more people being old, right? But this is a question of what happens when people become older, right? So this will change the goals of people. So it's not the same to live 100 years in perfect health than to live 50 years in perfect health. So in principle, when you have more time, like you guys, you invest more in knowledge, in education, all kinds of things. So psychologists tell us that when people are my age, we are less interested in learning and more interested in feeling good, okay? So if people live longer, then in principles they will discount the future less, they will be more patient, they will increase assets, investment in assets, because they will have longer returns, health, education. So there are positive things of that. Of course, technology will change and you will have to re-educate yourself. But also there is potentially less bequest, so there is going to be more intergenerational inequality. And there is also an ambiguous effect on innovation, because more older people means fewer ideas, fewer new ideas. So it's unclear what's going to happen there, right? So these are things that go beyond science fiction. This is longevity. And I think this is enough. Thank you so much for your time, and I'll see you later on.